For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. A prominent political and human rights figure in Zimbabwe, David Coltart, discusses his latest book, The Struggle Continues. Can you briefly unpack the book's title, The Struggle Continues?
The main title is The Struggle Continues, and it has a subtitle, 50 Years of Tyranny in Zimbabwe. And the main meaning behind the title is the struggle for democracy in Zimbabwe. The 50 years in the subtitle relates to the period since Ian Smith declared independence unilaterally from Britain on the 11th of November 1965, which takes us to, of course, November 2015. But the book deals with a span of some 60 years of my life, which is the overall period of this struggle which continues.
You served as a principal defense counsel for a wide range of Zimbabwean politicians who had fallen afoul of Robert Mugabe's regime. Can you tell us about that experience?
It started off in the 1980s. ZANU-PF, Robert Mugabe's party, wanted to bring about a one-party state in Zimbabwe. And their main opposition at that time was Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU party. And in an effort to crush that party, one of their tactics was to detain many of the senior leaders of ZAPU. And at the same time, they threatened a lot of black lawyers. So as a young lawyer, I had only been out of university a couple of years. I suddenly got instructions to represent a lot of the Central Committee members of ZAPU, of Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU party, including people like Stephen Nkomo, that's Joshua Nkomo's brother, Edward Ndlovu, and Sidney Malunga, who was then the chief whip of ZAPU. And there was a major political trial in 1985, 1986, when the ZANU-PF government prosecuted Malunga, alleging that he had been supporting armed political dissidents. There was no substance to the case, but I was instructed to represent him, and I secured his acquittal in 1986, and the acquittal of other ZAPU leaders. Of course, that culminated in ZAPU and ZANU-PF uniting at the end of 1987. And so for a period of time, I didn't do that many defenses of political opponents. But when the MDC was launched in 1999, that role started up again. And I represented many fellow MDC members who'd lost the fight for parliamentary seats. We brought actions to prove that the election had been fraudulent. And then at the beginning of 2002, Morgan Tsvangirai himself and Welshman Ncube and Renson Gosela were charged with treason. And I had to then coordinate their criminal defense. I didn't appear myself in court because by that stage I was a member of parliament and too close to Tsvangirai and Ncube to effectively defend them. And we instructed George Bizos to represent Tsvangirai, as I say, Ncube and Gosela. But over the period of the last 33 years since being in Zimbabwe, I've defended many politicians and human rights activists.
You mentioned that there were many things, especially prior to independence in 1980, that you could have done differently if you had the benefits of maturity. What were some of these?
Well, as the book tells, along with all young white men, I faced conscription. And as a 17-year-old, I was conscripted and went in and fought on the side of the Rhodesian Front government. With the benefit of maturity and with the benefit of hindsight, I doubt very much whether I would have done that if I knew then what I know now. My parents, who were of a far more liberal disposition than me, desperately wanted me not to undergo conscription. But I got swept away by the propaganda of the time as a young, impressionable young man, and so didn't take into account their desires, much to their alarm. I think that is the main thing that I would have done differently.
Why were you so determined to share so many secrets through the book?
Zimbabwe never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as South Africa did. And whilst we all know the flaws of that process in South Africa, and that it hasn't, as we've seen in South Africa even the last few weeks, hasn't achieved the reconciliation that South Africans would desire, notwithstanding that, I still think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a very important step along the way of making people confront their past and getting people to seek forgiveness and to start the process of reconciliation. And as imperfect as it was, I think it's a great shame that Zimbabwe never had that. And I felt that Zimbabwe is still afflicted by the shocking human rights abuses which occurred under white minority rule, and even the abuses of which have occurred in the last 36 years. We all have to start someplace. Gandhi once said, "You should be the change that you want to see in the world." And I've tried to apply that principle. I can't criticize the Mugabe regime unless I come up front with the human rights abuses that were perpetrated by white minority governments, which I was a part of, in that I was part of that state apparatus. And I know that I'm going to be attacked for that. Propagandists and others will take what I say perhaps out of context without speaking about the rest of the book. But I still think that it's important for somebody to put their hand up to say, this is what happened. We have to draw a line in the sand. We have to move on. We need to turn our back on violence as a means of resolving political issues so that our country can move forward.
Why was it an easy decision for you to go back to Zimbabwe after completing your studies at UCT?
Well, it was a combination of things. Firstly, I was born in Zimbabwe, raised in Zimbabwe. I always loved the country. I love the people. I love the countryside. I love the hills. I love the trees. So it always had that pull on me. My wife, or at that stage my fiancé, had a similar desire to return to the land of her birth, even though both our parents had actually left. We were of one mind that we wanted to come back. And then I was encouraged by, at the time, what I felt were very positive political developments. I was encouraged by Robert Mugabe's speech at independence, where he spoke about turning swords into plowshares. And then he sent me a personal telegram in 1981 when I was a student leader facing deportation by the apartheid regime. And he quoted Roosevelt at the end of the telegram and said, "In returning to Zimbabwe, you've got nothing to fear but fear itself." So when you get an encouragement from a prime minister, an iconic figure like that, and you have a pre-existing desire to come back, it became an almost irresistible force to return to the country of my birth. And I've never regretted it, despite all the problems that we have faced in Zimbabwe in the 33 years since I returned.
Mugabe once referred to you as a traitor worthy of remaining in the country only as a resident of one of its prisons. How did you feel about that?
Well, that's not the only threat leveled against me by Robert Mugabe. He said that at Harare Airport in September 2002, when he was particularly angry with me. He'd made an earlier threat against me and others in 1999 accused us of being traitors, of being agents trying to destabilize the country when we had issued a major human rights report documenting gross human rights abuses. And when the head of state mentions your name personally, you take it very seriously, especially with the knowledge that I have had representing people who've clashed with Mugabe, representing people in ZAPU and others. I know just how seriously one should take those threats. So it was very unpleasant. I had to increase my security. And of course, within a few months of those threats being made in 2002, I suffered several attempts on my life, culminating in a very serious one in March 2003.
What do you think Zimbabwe needs at the moment?
In the final chapter of the book, I say that Zimbabwe is a country which is incredibly blessed. It has highly literate people, hardworking people, wonderful rivers and lakes and productive fields and mountains and great tourist facilities and minerals galore, as many minerals per capita certainly as South Africa. But it misses one ingredient, one critical ingredient, namely democracy. It hasn't really ever experienced democracy since it became a defined modern nation state way back in 1890. And the simple answer to your question is we have to root democracy. We have to respect the genuine will of the people to elect leaders they want to. We have to ensure that all people are equal before the law, that the rule of law prevails, that the many rights in what is actually quite a fine constitution that we all agreed to in 2013 are implemented and respected. Rights of freedom of expression, rights of freedom of association, rights not to be interfered with, all of those rights. When we respect those, or at least begin down the road of respecting those, Zimbabwe will boom. It'll be a fantastic place to visit, to invest in, to have a holiday in.
If you were given an opportunity to speak to President Mugabe, what would you say?
Well, I know him very well now because having been a minister for four and a half years when he was president, I ended up being Minister of Education, Sport, Arts and Culture in the GNU, which commenced in February 2009. I got to know him well. I met him in cabinet every week, often had one-on-one meetings with him, and our relationship changed. A relationship which had been marked by threats leveled against me changed to a functional relationship. We still disagreed on most things, but when it came to education, to give Robert Mugabe credit, he backed me and backed my programs to stabilize the education sector and to grow it. And so through that, I think in that narrow area of government, there developed a mutual respect. I respected him, that despite whatever else he's done, I understand that he does have a heart for education. And I think that his perception of me changed somewhat. I think his perception was that I was a die-hard Rhodesian, wanting to bring Rhodesia back, that I wouldn't care a hoot for young black children. And I think when he saw the energy that I injected towards the poorest black children's education, he realized that perhaps there was another side to me, as I understood that there was also another side to him. So that's a long way of answering your question. To get to the nub of your question, what would I say to Robert Mugabe? Today, I would say to him, Robert Mugabe, you're 92. Our country is in a crisis. We have one of the worst droughts in living memory. The economy is collapsing. Business confidence is low. Our schools are starting to crumble. We need a person with much greater energy. It's time for you to retire, to go and enjoy your children, your grandchildren, and in the twilight years of your life, just go and relax, but let younger people take on the struggle and the role of leading Zimbabwe towards a better day and a new day.
And lastly, we had Joyce Mujuru, Zimbabwe's former deputy president, recently launched her own political party to challenge the veteran leader. Do you think her party will be a good opposition?
I can't say whether it will be a good opposition because only time will tell that. What I do know is that she is a significant player in the Zimbabwean political scene. She cannot be ignored. She enjoys widespread support. She is a charismatic person. My experience of her in cabinet, and once again I was with her in cabinet for 4.5 years, I saw a person who, although she was a guerrilla, has turned her back on violence. I think she realizes that violence has been one of the major problems within Zimbabwe. I think she's a practical person. She certainly backed me on many of the policies I was trying to implement. And unlike so many other opposition leaders, including myself, she has impeccable liberation war credentials. She will enjoy the support of many former Zanla and Zipra guerrillas, which is very important for the country. We need to avoid the spectre of a military coup. And that was always threatened. It doesn't justify not allowing Morgan Tsvangirai to lead, but it is a political reality that we couldn't ignore. I think the chance of the military threatening any form of coup is greatly lessened through the declaration by Joyce Mujuru that she's going to contest for office. But I'll say one final thing, that as charismatic and as popular as Joyce Mujuru is, she cannot win an election on her own. We desperately need a coalition of democratic political parties who have turned their backs on violence. And I think if she becomes part of a coalition, a very formidable political force will emerge in Zimbabwe, which may well end ZANU-PF's hegemony in the country.
That was David Cottard speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about his latest book, The Struggle Continues.